Well, Chris is back. Daryl's going to take a couple of weeks yet to get back on the video team or the podcast team. But Chris, welcome back. I hope
Thanks.
you had some good. Where have you been traveling? Why don't you just give us a quick overview?
Well, kind of on an impulse, we signed up for a trip to go see an eclipse, a solar eclipse. So that was one of the things that we've been doing. We had the chance to see the total solar eclipse of the sun from a ship off the coast of Mazatlan, which was beautiful. And then my mother and father-in-law are on an around the world cruise, and they're of a is not surprising, probably looking at me, they're of an older age, and we were a little worried about them, and we were able to join them for part of that trip between Tokyo and Singapore. And so we got to look after them for a little bit and see that they were well taken care of and come home with some more greater peace of mind. So those are the two places we've
Great.
been recently, and they were a lot of fun. We got to go to on the one with the solar eclipse. We went through Hawaii and Victoria and Vancouver too. So that was really fun. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. And how do you keep from gaining weight on those ships?
Well, it's like annual rebalancing. So I I think I picked up over those two trips about 10 pounds, and now I'm rebalancing.
Okay,
I'm down
that's
about 3 or 4 already, and I'm on my way back to getting to my normal weight.
good for you. Good for you. Well, as our viewers may note, I have a new office or a new room where I'm doing the podcasts and the videos. This used to be my wife's office, and she has now taken my office up the stairs. So she is the one now climbing the stairs, and I'm here on the main floor, thanks to her, and it actually feels very cozy, and I'm pleased to be here. So we have a couple of topics today that I think are really going to help some of our viewers. Chris, you did two really fine presentations. I didn't listen to the podcast. I watched the videos, but the one on best in class ETFs and the other on two funds for life. And I know we've had a number of questions, and I get a lot of questions just in talking to people on the phone about both of those topics. But first of all, I've got to say thank you. And all anybody has to do is take a look at the comments underneath your presentations to know how at least a handful, or more than a handful, but a lot of people really appreciated the teaching that you did, Chris, and so really thank you for that. But I think there are some things that would be worthwhile kind of taking some time to walk through on each of them. And so I would like, if we can, to start the topic on the two funds for life, because I think that's the area where we're appealing to a lot of folks who don't want to have to dig into picking ETFs or mutual funds or the sort, but want to make it dirt simple, as simple as can be. And I had the pleasure this week of talking to about 60 doctors and other healthcare workers at Permanente medical office down in California. And it made me dig into another target date fund, which I'm anxious to share with you and to share with our folks who follow that work. So let's talk two funds for life. When you first came up with this idea back in 2017 or 18 and started working on it, the first strategy I thought was brilliant, and that was to determine the amount of small cap value in a portfolio that is going to be some combination for most people who follow it of small cap value and a target date fund. And the way that you put that together, you used a multiple of 1.5 times your age, and that would be how much you have in the target date fund and the balance in small cap value, which means if you were a 20-year-old, it means 30% is going to be in the target date fund conservatively, and the other 70% more aggressively in the small cap value fund. And then as you're 40 and 50 and 60, the 1.5 means you're holding less and less of the small cap value. Now, that was, I think, the first approach that you used. And it may have been uncomfortable for some people to have 70% or 60% or 50% of their money in small cap value, but that was the way it worked because you believed that when we're young, that it's okay to have that greater exposure to that small cap value, and when we're old, it's okay to have less. So then later you changed it. I mean, not only did you add the 10 and the 20% to the portfolio instead of doing the 1.5 times, but then for a while you used you added 1.5 times the years to retirement. So you've got basically three ways to manage this. Talk us through some of that history and how you came upon and how you modified, and now kind of where you feel is the sweet spot for the two funds for life.
Yeah, you're bringing up all my dirty laundry. If I knew the end from the beginning, it would have helped probably many of our students and me in writing the book and everything else. The starting point you and I collaborated on, and I still like it as a starting point. When I wrote the book, I tested a much wider range of possibilities, and I learned some things. I mean, it took a good year or two of research in writing the book, and we discovered some things along the way, and we also acknowledged some things along the way. Perhaps the biggest thing to acknowledge is that not everybody retires at 65. If you're a FIRE person, financial independence, retire early, maybe your retirement date is 50, maybe it's 40. So having the 1.5 times age so that you get to the mature point in the target date fund, its retirement date, and you drive the small cap value to zero around that date at age 65 doesn't work for everyone. But if you use retirement age instead as a multiplier, and you do 1.5 times years to retirement in the target date fund, so you kind of flip it around, now that works for people regardless of their retirement date. So that was part of it, was just acknowledging that not everybody's going to retire at 65. But as I ran the back tests, one of the things you find is that increased allocation in the early years doesn't make as big a difference as you might think, because you have $0 or a few dollars. Yeah. And so that kind of leads you down the path of, well, maybe you want to have an allocation that's greater in the later years in retirement. And when you test that, you find out that actually improves the safe withdrawal rate, which is that's a good thing for retirees. It's actually, although they may experience deeper drawdowns and greater fluctuations in the balance of their account, at least historically, would have been more resilient because it's more diversified. Mm-hmm. And then so that led us to consider the very aggressive approach we have in the book, where you have a multiplier, and we actually have a higher multiplier, 2.5 times age or times years to retirement, with a 20% floor, so that you keep some in retirement. And then, if you really think about it, all of the other portfolios we have are half in small and half in value. So you could go half in the target date fund and half in small cap value, and you wouldn't be any more aggressively tilted to small in value than we are in the rest of the portfolios we recommend. And so that's an interesting thought, is just that maybe we're being too conservative in how we're nudging people. And then the final piece is, I really, really, really like to get to a point where Daryl includes something to do with two funds for life. And to do that, you have to think of it as a constant allocation. So, this idea that you would add 10% of small cap value and hold it throughout, or 20%. We included that in the book, but you could also add this scenario of 30%, 40%, 50%. And that's what I've put in the fine tuning table that is now available in the portfolio configurator. And I think those have this advantage that they're simple and easy to understand.
Yeah.
And if I was to go back to the beginning of all of this work and think about it, that's probably the piece that concerns me the most, is that a lot of it is too complicated for people to easily understand. Now, we have really dedicated, smart people who follow our work who are doing it just fine. And I compliment them. That's great. And especially if it's working for them. But I think that a broader audience would probably need something simpler. And that's where I like this idea of just the fixed fine tuning allocation table that you can look at. And I'll pull that up.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So if we go to the website and we go over to portfolios and then down to portfolio configurator, this lets us generate portfolios based on our best in class ETF recommendations for both the sound investing portfolios that we have, like the Ultimate Buy and Hold, Worldwide 4 Fund, and all of those, or for two funds for life. And in addition, I have here a two funds for life fine tuning tab over on the left hand side. And if we click that, you can see for a variety of combinations of small cap value and target date fund down the left hand side, we've characterized at different points in the glide path, very early, say for like a 2050, 2065 target date fund, to, all the way through to retirement, where you're 0 years to retirement, like a 2025 target date fund, or all the way into retirement, like a 2015 target date fund. And for all of those combinations on this chart, we tell you what the historical compound rate of return was, what the worst 10-year compound rate of return was, or compound annual growth rate, CAGR, the standard deviation, or how volatile it's been, the worst drawdown that we've seen since 1970, and the 30-year safe withdrawal rate going back to 1928. And so somebody can look at this and say, well, if I've signed up just for the target date fund, this is the ride I would expect as I go through the glide path of the target date fund and it's managed for me. Or if I add 10% small cap value and rebalance annually, then I get a different set of answers, or all the way up to, the 50-50. So, and somebody doesn't have to go straight across the chart. You can stay in a box by changing your target date fund over time. You can move up and down in the chart over time. I think this is easier to understand, and I think it for one of my great aspirations is for Daryl, if he wanted to add this to any of the tables he already creates, all he has to do is pick up an asset allocation here, and we could start to get to the point where we have an apples to apples comparison for some of the sound investing portfolios that we do, as well as the two funds for life. And I think that would be an interesting place to get to. That's one of my big aspirations. Yeah.
So Chris, to dig it just a little bit deeper into this table, because there are all sorts of hopeful lessons here. Let's looking at the zero small cap value, 100% target date fund. For people who are 25 or more years away from retirement, during that period of time, it shows a 9.8% compound rate of return. Now, as I understand it, that number is created by averaging a whole bunch of different periods of time. Tell us about what you use to get that 9.8%.
To get that 9.8%, what I did was actually, it's pretty simple. I just took the asset allocation of the target date fund since 1970. So it's just one period of time, and it's a 10% allocation. Since it's based on Vanguard, it's a 10% allocation to bonds. It's a 36% allocation to international large cap blend, or that could be total stock market. It'd be about the same return, and 54% to the total U.S. stock market. The only reason I used international large cap blend is that that's an asset class that we use in our other portfolios, so that return sequence is available. But yeah, that 9.8% is just for a fixed portfolio over the history we have since 1970.
And the worst 10 years, is that starting a calendar year, or?
That is the worst 10 years starting by calendar year. And the reason I know that is that the way this table was built is on annual returns, assuming annual rebalancing. So there wasn't monthly data in this table. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, that's great. But what I do see is, as we start adding 10% small cap value, the worst 10 years gets better.
Yes.
And I think that's meaningful, because we're always about figuring out how to put it together so people stay the course. And the worst of times that's typically the place where people decide to quit. And by the time you're into 30% small cap value, you go from 1.1% return to 3.2% return. So you've tripled the compound rate of return there. And what is the easiest way to get a sense of how the risk compares in those two situations, the 0% small cap value and the 30%?
I think the most intuitive way to see the risk is probably the worst case drawdown. So for the 100% target date fund, that was 48%. And for the 30% small cap value, 70% target date fund, that worst case drawdown was 51%. So even though the volatility went from 13.4% to 14.8% standard deviation, so that's the variability of the returns, the drawdown didn't get that much worse. And the reason is that some of the volatility increases to the upside. And you don't really care about that much. I mean, I'll take all the volatility to the upside you want to give me. I'll take as much of that as you want to give me. It's the volatility to the downside that really matters. And the worst case drawdown in this chart is a better measure of that.
And we did a study a fine tuning table where we compared all the different combinations of small cap value and S&P 500 in 10% increments. And what did surprise me was that the 50-50 strategy with the S&P 500 and the small cap value. The risk, when we looked at things like average return, average loss in a losing year, and the things that might create some sort of emotional response. Actually, you were better with 50-50 than you were with the S&P 500.
And the reason is it's more meaningfully diversified. The S&P 500 exposes you to market risk. That's the only thing you get. And the target date fund is the same way in the early years. It gives you just a little bit of exposure to risk factors associated with bonds, but it's so small with that 10% that it's not much. Almost all of the all of the growth potential you're getting is coming from exposure to market risk. Yeah. And when you add in small cap value, now you're getting exposure to the size risk, to the value risk, to if you pick right, maybe quality as well. And so you have, instead of having a 1-cylinder engine, you got a 3-cylinder or a 4-cylinder engine, and it's going to run smoother. That's the gist of it. Yeah.
So I'm glad you took it all the way to 50%. It may not be comfortable for a 60-year-old, but I would certainly think if somebody in their 20s or 30s took a look at that other table, that it would be meaningful. I was pleasantly surprised. I'm always looking for an extra 0.5% for the folks that follow our work, because we know that compounded that is meaningful. And the question is what we're saying should lead to a 0.5% actually probable? I see here that adding every 10% of small cap value does give a legitimate shot at about an extra 0.5%. That's cool, and I think that's probable. I
agree. It may take you a number of years to get it right. I mean, we know that's one of the challenges with small cap values. You have to tolerate long periods of not getting the premium, but if you have the discipline to stick with it, I agree with you that there's a very high likelihood it's going to help you out.
So then when I spoke to the doctors and the healthcare workers this week, because their 401k plan had BlackRock instead of Vanguard. And we have shown BlackRock in our presentations for years, just to show people there's a difference between how people may decide to manage a target date fund. But it forced me to look a little closer, and I asked myself, because BlackRock doesn't have any bonds in the portfolio in the early years, and also because in the latter years, like right now at my age, Vanguard would have me 30% in equity, and BlackRock would have me 40%. And BlackRock has no fixed income in those early years, and Vanguard has 10%. So I said, wow, that is starting to look like another 0.5% potentially. Yeah. And so these numbers are not statistically meaningful because the period of time is so short. But in preparation for that meeting, I just took a look quickly at the last about 4.5 years. Why? Because I could look at AVUV along with these two target date funds. But without AVUV, the compound rate of return for Vanguard was 9.02. I was looking at a 2065, and for BlackRock, 9.52. I mean, it was like it knew I wanted an extra 0.5%. And then I looked at adding 10% AVUV to the portfolio using BlackRock. And in fact, it takes the return up to about 10.1, another 0.5%. And then I looked at going to 20%, another 0.5%. In fact, six tenths of 1%. And so it made me realize we need to look beyond Vanguard. When we talk to people about target date funds, we need to look beyond Vanguard to other sources of index based. I'm not looking for active management because I think we lose 0.5% there, but index based, where they are using closer to what we would like to have them using, and that is no fixed income in the early years. Is there anything in that story that you think could be a little bit misleading?
I don't think so. I agree with you that the more aggressive approach of the BlackRock target date fund glide path is likely to lead to a higher return. It's going to have a little higher volatility as you go along as well. And if you're being aggressive about your plan and you're going to go 50-50, 50% small cap value, 50% target date fund, the difference would be small because now you're going to take a 10% allocation and divide it by 2. So you only have a 5% allocation to bonds, even with Vanguard. And instead of having a 10% equity allocation difference in retirement, it goes to a 5%. So it kind of depends on where you want to be. The biggest reason I don't put a lot of time and energy into evaluating best-in-class target date funds is that I know for most people, they don't have a choice. For most people, you're offered one target date fund family in your 401k or your employer's plan, and that's all you've got. And so knowing that there's something better on the other side of the fence, it might be just too hard to get it for you. But I do think we should emphasize more often probably that, an expensive, a target date fund with a high expense ratio could undo all of the benefits. And that would be a bad thing. You'd be better off managing your own glide path in that circumstance. But between BlackRock and Vanguard, I think a lot of people could be very successful looking at this table, using it as an approximation to set expectations and then moving ahead. And it's really, like you said, it's the actively managed expensive funds. That's where I think it gets the hackles up on our neck and we go, no, don't do that. Yeah.
And by the way, we do have people still questioning the idea of using the Avantis funds, AVUV, in the case of the small cap value, because they're expensive, and they could get a mutual fund or an ETF at Vanguard for about 1/3, 2/3 less cost. And while we're on this topic, why don't you address, please, that decision and why it makes sense, if it does, to pay 0.25% instead of 0.7%. I'm sorry, 0.07
Well, what we know about Avantis's approach is that they filter not just on size and value, but they also filter on quality and momentum. DFA also filters on momentum. And we know that historically, momentum and quality have both been worth several percentage points. We'll just leave it at 3-ish percentage points or more. And I'm underestimating by a lot. I think quality is actually closer to 5 and momentum might be 5 or 6. So let's just say for a second, though, that they're worth 3 percentage points each. And let's say that in both cases, you only get 1/4 of that 3 percentage points. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, 1/4 of 3 is 0.75%. And if you get them both, that's 1.5%. So is it worth paying 0.25% in an expense ratio to get potentially another 1.5% in return? That's the gist of what what we do when we analyze the best in class ETFs is we look at how much exposure do you get to these different risk factors that have a historical track record of generating returns, not just in the US, but internationally, globally, across markets, across asset classes. And how much more of it do you get relative to what you pay? And if it looks like what you get is worth more than what you pay, then that starts to look like a good investment. So yeah, you could get a cheaper fund, but I think you would give up this potential return and diversification. So that's the other thing we know is if you have a portfolio that has exposure to more of these risk factors, it's going to deliver more consistently over time. Where if you have a portfolio that's only firing on one cylinder, going back to my engine analogy, just market in size or market in size and value, it's going to be less consistent in delivering those returns. At least it has been in the past. There's no guarantees in the future, but in the past, over long periods of time, it seems like you're better off having exposure to a wider range of these. And so I feel very comfortable with that 1/4% that it's money well spent.
That's great. And a lot of these people in their 401k they have target date funds, but they don't have small cap value. And when we do find small cap value, they're very often actively managed small cap value because some manager did better than the index, and that qualifies to them to be best in class when the trustees pick it. And of course, we'd rather have them going into an index fund. But so what they end up doing is having to find that small cap value, maybe in an IRA, maybe a regular IRA, maybe a Roth IRA. Becomes a little more complex to try to manage. But how do you feel, and I don't know what you could say about expected additional return, but if somebody is building that so it's hard to rebalance, and that they basically, other than maybe what they put in could be used as a way of rebalancing, I suspect. But just the idea that one might be putting away 10% or 20% a year through a Roth and just let it go, don't rebalance. The implications of that over a long period of time would look like what, Chris?
Well, just to clarify, when you say putting 10% or 20% into the Roth, I think what you're saying is 10 or 20% of their total retirement savings, right? So
yes,
I've thought often that, if somebody's saving 10% towards retirement, a dime out of every dollar, now you're talking about putting one or two of the pennies out of the dime into the Roth IRA or the traditional IRA. So the way I think it would likely play out is that either it's going to underperform or outperform, and in any given year, that's a flip of a coin. And so hopefully if it underperforms, they've learned enough to know they should stay the course and keep putting that percentage in. And if, as we would expect over time at a 10-year horizon, a 15-year horizon, a 20-year horizon, it has outperformed, you're right that they could rebalance by putting nothing in that year or putting less in. What I would like to think, though, is that as they gain confidence in the asset class, that they would stick with it. They'd say, hey, this thing seems to be working. I'll continue putting my 10% or 20% of my retirement savings into small cap value. Now, what that means for the portfolio overall is that it becomes more volatile, because if you have a higher allocation to this more volatile asset, then you're going to see deeper potential worst case drawdowns and more variation in your annual returns. And so you don't want to exceed your ability to stomach that and stick with it. But, hopefully if, as you get to those nearer years of retirement, you're an oversaver at that point and you've got more than you need, maybe you have a higher capacity then to tolerate some of that volatility as well. But that's a very personal thing. And if you feel like if an investor feels like the volatility is getting to be too big for them, they could rebalance even within the IRA. They could go in and rebalance. They could say, I'm going to take a percentage of this small cap value and move it into large cap blend to balance things out. And they wouldn't have tax implications or capital gains to realize. So they could do that as well, or even incorporate some fixed income if needed. And I think we give them all the tools to figure that out if you look at the portfolio as a whole. So I think they have a lot of levers. I think it's a great strategy. And it's impossible for me to model all the scenarios that would happen, but I think there's enough positive options down that path that it's a good one.
Let's put that table back up just one more time and see if there isn't one more lesson on there that we can leave for our I keep using the word students. I don't know if that is demeaning or not, but the people who are looking to us to learn something. When I look at this table, and we're talking about the 25-year-old person that gentleman was asking about, how do we use this table to create a lifetime of returns? I think most of our folks know how to use a calculator. They can't go to our lifetime investment calculator to do that with the target date funds at this point. But walk us through how you would show those 25-year-olds how they would likely do over a lifetime.
Well, it's a little bit of a tricky math problem, because what you're going to get is whatever box you're in over time. If you stay in let's just take the simplest case, the target date fund. Let's say you go 100% in the target date fund throughout your life. Well, when you're age 25, you're going to get historically an expected compound annual growth rate of 9.8% with this drawdown. When you have a little bit more money, you're going to get a little bit lower return, and so forth and so on across the chart. And when you're nearing retirement and you have the greatest amount of money, you're going to be getting these returns of 9.0, 8.7, and 8.0%. It's really hard without building an Excel spreadsheet and putting in some savings rate and then following through with what you think the compound rates of return are, to say what your total would be, what your total experience would be. And that's why in the book I ran all of these different scenarios with rolling start dates, was so you could get an idea of what the history says a bad luck scenario would be, a medium luck scenario, a good luck scenario. I think, though, that what people are going to try to do probably is get the best return that they can at any point in time for whatever their risk tolerance and capacity is. So we know that our risk capacity declines over time because we have fewer years to work. And so we should probably be seeing the volatility and the worst drawdowns decline as we get closer to retirement. Plus, we're probably more nervous about the size of the balance. Yeah. But within that constraint, there's also an emotional component, which you've brought up with your fine-tuning tables, that as an advisor, you sat across the table and talked to people and said, would you be okay losing 50% of your retirement savings? Mm-hmm. And the truth is, most of us probably overestimate by a little bit what that capacity is, because it's easier in the abstract to say you could tolerate something than in the concrete. When the market has gone down 50% and there's no evidence it's ready to turn around, that's when it's really, really hard for people. And so I think people are going to look at this chart and they're going to find their comfort zone year by year as they go across it. And that may mean moving up and down on the chart in the amount that they have allocated to small cap value. It may mean just riding all the way across in a row. And in terms of their expectations of return, it's going to be that dollar weighted average, which depends on how fast they save at different ages and what their luck has been. Yeah, it's hard. It's a hard question to answer.
Got it. By the way, I just realized that there are a couple more two funds for life questions that could be quickly.
I'm game.
And
I'm game.
okay, good. And that is in the small cap value. Would you be endorsing a combination of international and U.S. small cap value as opposed to only U.S.?
Yes, and I think that comes down to a personal preference and comfort level. The target date fund is going to give you international diversification already. It probably will tilt to the United States. So if you want to maintain the same allocation that the target date fund has, say something like a 65-35, I think that's close to what Vanguard has right now. You could do that same allocation between a U.S. small cap value and international small cap value. Or if you feel uncomfortable with the target date fund tilting too much internationally, you might decide to be 100% small cap value in the U.S., 100% U.S. in small cap value. So I think that's a personal thing. It's hard with any statistical significance to say how that's going to change the return, because we just don't have enough history on international asset classes compared to the United States.
And we do have tables, fine-tuning tables for a worldwide small cap value portfolio, so that both 50-50 and 70-30.
Yes, we do.
You can go check those out on the page, the fine tuning your asset allocation page in the boot camp. You know something? I think we've done it, Chris. As always, you've done a great job, and appreciate your time. And we'll get back together, and we'll be talking to them about best in class. I know one of them, they want to know right now. They want to know. They do not want to wait. They want to know when you are going to update the list of ETF recommendations.
I will update it at the beginning of 2025. I'm going to stick with my 2-year cycle. I haven't seen anything yet to make me think we need any kind of interim update. I feel like the recommendations we have there are still very solid. And one of the challenges, because a lot of people, they see a new fund and they want me to evaluate it right away and say, is this better or worse? One of the challenges is a lot of times there's not enough history. There's not enough time to analyze to really know what the fund is doing, how it's performing. And a lot of times that goes along with a lack of liquidity too. When a fund is new, the assets under management are small, you can see bigger bid-ask spreads, and that makes it harder to trade efficiently without paying a penalty to the smarter trader on the other side of the trade. So I think by the time 2025 rolls around, we'll have some interesting new candidates that have enough history and enough assets under management that'll be a worthwhile exercise. But for now, I think we've got great recommendations and still very comfortable with them.
Great. Chris, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you who join us on a regular basis. The one of the best things you can do to help us is to share this information with others. And by the way, many of you have recently sent donations to help us in our work. That is greatly appreciated. And we are a 50C3 nonprofit, so it is, if appropriate, tax deductible. But most of all, we really appreciate having the opportunity to help you and your family. Good luck.